Good afternoon. Thank you, Benjamin, for those kind words of introduction. First and foremost, Carie and I would like to express our gratitude to the University of Illinois School of Architecture and to our dear friend, Francisco Paco Rodriguez, for having invited us to deliver this lecture as part of this year's lecture series. We are very happy to be able to share some of our ideas, some of our strategies, and work with you as it reflects many of our central preoccupations and core values, including an interest, as I was mentioned earlier, in the vernacular, as well as the pursuit of an architecture of place, material realism, and identity. However, for us, this is not only a regional preoccupation concerned with the particular and the local, but also a universal one, and one which includes the validity of universal and timeless architectural principles, such as scale, proportion, the relationship between the parts, and the effect of physical form upon the spirit. We also believe that the vernacular and the study of it, which we have called vernacularology, is a generative grammar rather than a fixed tradition, and one which it also incorporates modern buildings and products of mass culture. And although we realize that many of these issues are arguably somewhat marginal in today's architectural climate, we believe they are extremely pertinent, and dare we say, more urgent than ever. Today, we will show you 6 projects. 4 of these projects are located in Miami, and the other 2 are projects located in Central America, Guatemala to be more specific. And we begin with this map as it's a map that describes both the geographic and the cultural context of our work. And as you can see, Miami is at the very center of the image. Miami is arguably a city in between 2 worlds, a city that when viewed from the north can seem like an exotic province, an outpost. And yet, when seen from the Caribbean and South America, it is a center. It is a city located at either the edge or the core, depending on your frame of reference. And as such, it is a city that is continuously reinventing itself. And the Caribbean, for us, in Caribbean's cultural context, geographic circumstance, and natural setting, has had a profound and often defining influence in the configuration and the very constitution of the city of Miami. For us, Miami belongs to the world of the Bahamas. Miami belongs to the world of Jamaica, Dominican Republic, Haiti, Puerto Rico, Curacao, St. Kitts, Colombia, Guatemala, and Cuba. So while there are certainly differences in both the natural and built-in landscapes of these places, the expansive skies, the emerald green sea, the sponge-like geology, and the fantastic flora and fauna, these are all shared phenomena. You see, for us, this world of the Caribbean is a world full of light and scorching heat that could only be painted, that could only be described with intense blues and greens. The Caribbean, as defined by the Colombian writer Gabriel Garcia Marquez, is a place both vivid and terrible, with a dust-choked air that carries the smell of sleeping alligators. But the Caribbean is also a magical world, a world of overlapping cultures. It's where the transcendental encounter of the olive and the corn took place, and where many impulses and traditions cross each other. And this confluence produces a kind of mestizaje, a blending, both in the people and as well as in the built environment. This is the world we come from. Miami, founded in 1896, is a young city, a little over a century in the making, and still under construction. Miami exists in a precarious line between the metropolis and the swamp, between nature and artifice, business and leisure, myth and reality, virtue and vice. This slide that you see depicts the geography of Miami, a very beautiful geography with Miami Beach and the Atlantic Ocean to the east and south, as well as the swampland of the Everglades all the way to the west, on the left of the image. A very vulnerable geography affected by climate change. There's also the Miami River running east to the expansive waters of Biscayne Bay and the place where the city was born and where downtown Miami begins. Up above in the image, north of downtown is Little Haiti, Wynwood, the Design District, as well as Coconut Grove, Little Havana, and Coral Gables to the south. all making part of this mostly manufactured constellation of interconnected cities and islands that are part of our collective memory of Miami. Carie and I, both of us, we both spent our formative years as young students of architecture in Miami and returned there to establish our practice and pursue our teaching careers at the University of Miami. So in a way, our personal histories are tied to the history and the temperament of this place, and our own DNA lies in the Caribbean, being both Cuban and Colombian. However, while we embrace all that makes our geographic circumstance unique and vibrant, we are not blind to the many of the city's shortcomings. We are fully aware that much of Miami is being built cheaply and quickly, and that little consideration is being made or given to the ways in which individual buildings contribute to the construction of the city over time. Now, these drone images that I'll show you, that we're showing you at the moment, are videos and images produced with the collaboration of the Center for Computational Science and our own University of Miami School of Architecture students, which depict an aerial view of an informal settlement in Barranquilla, Colombia, called Las Flores. And is part of an ongoing research of this type of complex urban environments in the global South, which we have been engaging with our students in a studio called, which we've titled, Vernacularology, which in fact not only studies the local realities of these places, but also includes our preoccupation and concern with larger themes such as our constant search to root buildings in a culture of place, our interest in both the vernacular and the academic, in the ancient and the contemporary, in the commonplace and the extraordinary, and perhaps due to our own reality, we are able to coexist comfortably in these two seemingly opposed worlds. We are open to finding beauty in differences and are always drawn to what makes a place unique. As a result, we're constantly asking ourselves, what is it that is culturally resonant about this place, and how can our work, reflect this? And so we find that these informal settlements, as the one that you just saw, which we believe to be vernacular expressions of a given people, are compelling places worthy of study and have many lessons to teach us, including issues regarding urban form, issues regarding compactness, resilience, and the respect for what exists, for what is there. We have explored these ideas and observations both in our practice and in our teaching at the University of Miami, and these lessons have inspired us or inspired the work that we will show you in the following images this evening. So now the first project that we will show you is a project that engages a kind of Miami vernacular, a vernacular which is increasingly difficult to define, but that offers us an endless amount of visual inspiration. The project is called MDO. This is a map, a location map of the project. It's located one lot south of Miami Trail, otherwise known as Southwest 8th Street, which is here shown as a kind of long road going across the page around the center of the map. It's also called 8th Street or Calle Ocho, and as it is known in many places in Miami or around Miami. It is one of Miami's main streets, and it runs east-west across the city. It's also important for it is the street that connects the great swamp of the Everglades on the far west with downtown in the mouth of the river and the bay on the east. Now, the pink rectangle that you see on the screen indicates the site where the building is located. The site plan also shows the immediate build context of the project as defined and surrounded, as you can see, by countless strip shopping malls and speculative office buildings. And typical of this area of Miami, most of these buildings are set a great distance away from the main road in their infinite need to accommodate extensive surface parking lots. The image also shows the manner in which the site backs up against a canal in one of the many bodies of water that cross through the city. Now, 8th Street or Calle Ocho is one of those American roads where the commercial signage and the common artifacts of mass culture dominate the landscape, and where the signage is cleverly designed to both in scale and in placement to be seen not only from the sidewalk, but most importantly, from the car. The result, of course, as you can see in this image, is a collection of structures emblematic of Miami's bleak suburban landscape. Now, we should also mention that we began this project of MDO. We started working on this building at the beginning of the Great Recession. in that 2008, more or less, and that from the onset, from the very beginning, we had to confront the challenges of a limited budget, a less than optimal site, a stringent zoning and building code, and a builder that had already been selected. So you may be asking, why would you ever engage in such a project? And so frankly, we asked ourselves that very question many times, and yet we took it on. We took it on primarily because we found common ground with an unconventional client, a great client, a client who was interested in making a building to redefine their retail brand, and in so doing, transform their existing context. Needless to say, we also took it on because we understand that one cannot underestimate the importance of the client in the development of a young architectural practice, and that architects need patrons to be able to execute their ideas. And as many of you know, finding them and nurturing them is an elusive, lifelong pursuit. But we also wanted to engage a real and not an idealized Miami, not an idealized Miami Main Street, with the aim to confront the aesthetic challenge of working within the quotidian commercial landscape, recomposing and transforming the elements of the commercial vernacular, including the signage, the commercial shop fronts, the suburban lawn, even the painted asphalt that covers most of the city's streets. As you can see in this section of the project, the proposed project reverses the typical urban patterns of the area by pressing the building close to the street and placing the surface parking lots along the rear of the property. The plan, as you can see in this image, is composed of a principal double volume retail space with 55-foot span bridged using concrete double T's. These double T's are standard long span parking garages in the area, and the planned thickened walls are lined with stacked rows of merchandise, mostly in this case, mostly men's suits, which are placed then around the main space in front of the building. While most of the services of the office space take place in the rear and on the second floor level above, kind of mezzanine level. In section, the heightened volume and intentional shift in scale is an unexpected spatial experience for the area. This is an area which is mostly defined by low 8-foot ceilings, which are typically stacked one above the other. The section also shows our concern with the idea of the manipulation of daylight. And so we chose to flood the building with natural light and converting the strong direct natural light into a kind of soft, indirect ambient light. This of course, is in direct opposition to the cavernous, artificially lit interiors, which are typical of the adjacent strip malls and office parks. The skylights also presented us with an opportunity to hide some of the mechanical systems needed, such as the air conditioning systems, electrical systems, and others. As I mentioned earlier, the project started at the beginning of the recession, and therefore we almost by necessity, we were obliged to explore an architecture of scarcity, in a way doing more with less. And so we deployed a language of abstraction, a language of restraint, where the range of materials and compositional moves were limited to a very few carefully selected elements. One of the most prominent of these elements is a 10-foot diameter metallic sign, which is placed perpendicular to the building's front facade, which we thought that by removing this sign from the clutter of much of the signage that punctuates the existing road and setting it against a mute blank wall, this blank wall would provide a neutral backdrop. And so an element that would otherwise be ordinary within this context would immediately become extraordinary and perhaps and maybe even special. In addition, the base of the front elevation, as you can see here in this image, is inflected to compose the 12-foot high glass for the shop fronts and to produce a much needed recessed space that protects the visitor from rain or sun, it's Miami after all, upon entry, and also imbues the building with a degree of corporality and a degree of solidity, in sharp contrast again to the persistent thinness of the adjacent construction. In the south elevation, has only one opening. In this case, it is a large circular window that brings light into a small meeting space within the building as it faces the side entrance into the parking area. Here, once again, we wanted to produce an illusion of thickness. So we poured a deep circular concrete frame around the window and pressed the glass deep into the space of the opening. And this recess produced a more dramatic shadow on the exterior and served to further highlight the compositional difference between this window and those of the surrounding context, as well as reframing the surrounding landscape as one stands looking out from within the space. The rear facade, as you can see in this image, was conceived quite differently. We understood this to be the most, it's actually one of my favorites, the most utilitarian of the elevations. So this is the one that collects and composes the generic inventory of elements of the surrounding context, and the repertoire is all there. The out-swinging casement windows, the downspouts, the concrete eyebrows, the thickly applied colored asphalt, and its corresponding painted signage, all composed as a straightforward symmetrical facade that registers both the lower and upper levels in an intentional domestic scale. And lastly, a view from 8th Street from the car. This is a view that we think best represents the project, showing the building currently, as it is right now, standing a silent and rather enigmatic white box, here set in sharp contrast to the chorus of loud voices and gestures of the surrounding urban scene.
This is where we do the passing of the baton. So as Adib said, just as we were doing MDO and the office was catching steam, meaning we had several projects, everything came almost to a near halt. And so we had a choice, and we decided that we would be inspired to rethink the way that we practiced. We chose to see the challenge, the economic challenge of that Great Recession, as a way to create new opportunities. So we were invited to participate in a design workshop in Guatemala City, actually a country that neither one of us had ever been to. We packed our bags and we literally immersed ourselves in this week-long adventure. We met individuals in that week, that sort of week-long charrette, that changed the course of our practice and our lives and gave us the opportunity to do some of the work that I'm about to show you. I think what we learned from that experience is that if you want something that you don't currently have, you have to do something you've never done. So to get on a plane and engage in a week-long workshop within a context that we knew very little about gave us this opportunity. I'm showing you this video of one of the projects that we produced that I will describe in a minute. In traveling to Guatemala, we immersed ourselves in the rich cultural and architectural history of this place, with its rich architectural legacy and its stunning volcanic landscapes, of course, in sharp contrast to our flat landscapes in the Caribbean. We studied a range of architecture that included the complex and formidable Mayan temple precincts, as well as the humble and beautiful vernacular structures like this bohío. The bohío is a beautiful form that consists of a wattle and dub base and steeply thatched roof. Its form is the byproducts of local materials and a response to the particular conditions of place. I should reiterate that our sensibilities towards architecture and place were deeply influenced by the teachings of the great architectural historian Vincent Scully. Scully taught at the University of Miami, while Adib and I were undergraduate students there. And among his many books is one of my favorites, entitled The Natural and the Man-Made, where Scully describes the idea that cultures respond to place by either mimicking the forms of the context or setting itself in sharp contrast to it. So in this way, the profile of the bohío mimics the majestic volcanic landscapes in the distance. In our studies of Guatemalan architecture, we analyzed the siting of buildings within their context, and we noticed that the principal buildings organized their primary facades north-south to respond to the climate. We also focused on the study of the elements of architecture and their material constructions. On the left, we see a detail of a coquina stone facade detail and the way in which the projections in this part of the world produce very, very deep shadows because the sun tends to be overhead for most of the day. We took these lessons and immersed ourselves in one of our first projects in the country, which is the project to design a large corporate headquarters for a sugar mill in southern Guatemala. The site is located within a flat coastal landscape that is adjacent to the Pacific Ocean, seen here on this location map. The company had grown incrementally, and to accommodate this quick growth, they began to develop a series of buildings to house the different departments. This physical reality reinforced a separation of departments and caused a breakdown in communication and their ability to work creatively. So to counteract this, we developed a singular building that set itself at the center of a well-defined precinct. The building is precisely oriented to the cardinal points of the compass. As mentioned earlier, this is a manner of orienting buildings in this region that dates back to pre-Columbian Mayan civic building traditions. As such, the building's long axis is aligned east-west, allowing it to place the building parallel to the road, while providing an opportunity to establish the main entry on the north-south axis that will frame a view of one of the prominent volcanoes to the north. Here you see the building. Here you see the building within the site. This is an initial sketch of the project where the new building is seen to be composed of 3 parts: a plinth, the wall, and a roof, a steep roof. This early sketch shows our desire to raise the building off the ground so that we could set the first floor above the height of the sugarcane fields. Lifting the building from the ground allowed us to capitalize on the prevailing breezes from the southwest and protect the building from floodwaters during the rainy season. These are plans of the building. You see the first floor plan up at the top and the second floor plan below. And what you will immediately recognize is that it's made up of a series of repetitive modules. And this was done principally for economy and ease of construction. And so in a sense, when we began the project, you have to imagine that we're working within the Pacific coast of Guatemala, and much of the work that we wanted to do in order to make the building respond to its place had to do with the overall building's form. Later on, we would integrate a number of systems that would augment the performance of the building. But really, the goal was to arrive at those solutions through very low-tech means. So what you see from left to right is an auditorium, roughly the size of the auditorium that we are in right now, actually. We have a belvedere, which frames the entry view of the building, and I'll show you in a moment how it frames the volcano in the distance. And then the remainder of the building has a large central hall that is flanked to the north and the south by a series of conference rooms that are interspersed with courtyards between them. So while we had one large central room, we wanted to make sure that we had a variety of spaces in which the nearly 400 individuals that work for the company can choose to work and interact. Below, there's a mezzanine level, and at the far end, a kind of cafeteria space is on the second level. Here you see a longitudinal section of the building where you can clearly see the hierarchy of the volume from left to right, with the central hall that rises to an actual vented space at the top that allows for hot air to rise up and out of the building. One of the challenges for us in developing this section was not only to sculpt the building that could set itself against this expansive landscape, but also we were challenged by the clients to be able to open up the building for half of the day. And so this was a building that had to be both passively cooled as well as mechanically cooled. And so the shaping of the section allows us to do that for the sort of hottest moments of the day, which is typically between noon and about 3 or 4 in the afternoon. This drawing depicts the proposed building in context. We wanted the building to have a clearly discernible figure and a scale that could register again against that tropical landscape we were describing earlier. Our references came from both the industrial generic sheds of the area as well as the venerable Mayan pyramidal structures that we showed you before. Drawing plays a very important role in our practice. We are probably part of the last generation of designers that was principally trained by hand. The computer came into our repertoire during graduate school, and today we use these mediums interchangeably, depending on the investigation and the desired outcome. Here, we are not only interested in depicting the building within the particulars of this geographic and cultural context, but we're also interested in the narrative of the drawing and depicting the scene at a precise moment in time. This drawing is composed on the day that the harvest begins. It is entitled El Día de la Zafra and depicts a festive procession set on that day where the large statue of Our Lady of the Rosary is marched into the fields. I want to underscore that this is not a colonial conceit, but rather a depiction of a ritual, a meaningful ritual that continues to hold meaning today. This is another drawing that we produced for this project. This was a triptych. It's about 10 feet long, this project, and employed a series of techniques, both hand techniques as well as digital techniques, to produce the triptych, which is a typical view of the interior of the hall with the conference rooms that I described earlier, framing views in between that are actually designed as a large square opening, that from which you see the sugarcane fields in the foreground and those volcanic timeless landscapes in the distance. This is a model of the project, and we hesitated showing the model actually because the building has been built, but for us, the physical model has been an incredibly important tool, not just in the investigation of the project, but there have been several moments in developing the work where the development of the project seemed precarious, may not continue. This happens often in practice. And we found that the building of the physical model and the presentation of that model to clients allows for the building to become a reality in their mind, because it's the closest to the actual building that you can get. And so I found that in our practice, these physical models have been incredibly important in allowing us to move from drawing to actual building. This is actually the building set within those fields soon after the building was constructed. And here you see the framed view of that belvedere that I showed you in the plan, where you see the volcan, or they call it the volcano of fire, because it is constantly like spewing a kind of smoke from the very, very top. And it was intentional. The building was sited so that you could frame that view. To the left, you see the first sugar mill that we actually found in our walks of the barren site. And it was sort of left forgotten at one corner of the site. And when we saw it, we wanted to recover it, in part to connect the company to its own history, but also to reveal it as a kind of object in and of itself within the scale of the entry. Here you see it from an alternate view with a poured concrete base and then a stuccoed upper portion of the wall. This is a night view of the building, where again, you can see that tripartite composition of the facade, a very robust concrete poured base with a stuccoed intermediate plane, and then finally a metal roof that rises to culminate in the louvered lantern that I showed you in the elevation. This is the east elevation of the building with a kind of projected room from the dining hall that frames yet another view of one of the other volcanoes that can be seen from the site. And in the foreground, I would mention that the surface of the ground is a pebbled surface. And this pebble was found in a nearby river. And so we actually excavated the pebble and covered the ground. And so in a way, from the ground to the roof of the building, we were able to connect the building to this place. This is the main space before anybody moved in, which is when we were able to photograph it. This is a stair that was built to serve multiple purposes. On the one hand, it gains access to the mezzanine, obviously, but it also serves for impromptu lectures and gatherings of the community so that the space could be used in different ways. We had the good fortune of being able to design multiple aspects of the project, even including the furniture, which we drew and depicted here, or sort of custom door handles for paneling on the interiors, or even the kind of paneling on the exterior concrete wall that you see to the left. So that project actually took us several years in and out of Guatemala. And this next project is very different in scale and scope. But I wanted to be able to share with you the story of this project because it occurred, we weren't really searching for it. In a way, I think this project found us. And so in our drives to the mill, which again, we flew from Miami to Guatemala City and then drove about 3 hours to the southern coast of Guatemala, you drive through that flat coastal plain that is adjacent to the Pacific, and this is a largely rural area. It's a very poor area, largely sort of rural communities, many of which are informal, very much like the types of communities that we showed you in the drone mapping earlier, or that Adib referred to earlier. And so some of these structures are structures that we took photographs of along the way, where you can see how vulnerable many of these structures are, and how, because it's a low-lying area, tends to flood incessantly. And so buildings really need to seek ways to protect themselves. So again, in our travels, we came across a rural school that was really in disarray. And we felt responsible, in a way, as architects operating in this area of the world, to figure out if there was something that we could do to improve the conditions of the school. And I think we were moved to do this, not just as architects, but as educators, because we believe that really education is one key way to move beyond poverty. It gives you the tools to be able to search for a better life by giving you more opportunities. So the school was in disarray. It had two very small buildings that you can see on the upper right-hand portion of the site. And so what we proposed was to build a series of buildings here to the west and to the south that would wrap themselves around a kind of stand of mature landscape that existed on this site. What I can say is that what we decided to do was begin with the unit of the classroom building, and think of a kit of parts that could be assembled over time and could adjust themselves to the needs of the particular school and the community. So what you see in this drawing is that one room, sort of that first the platform and the one room classroom, and the way in which that one room could be assembled in different ways with open spaces, again, to derive a number of prototypes for the school. This is a longitudinal elevation of the building with a series of 5 repetitive modules, 5 classrooms, and a bank of bathrooms, which was really the extent of the project. And here again, we were presented with a very, very limited budget. I mean, if you could imagine this is about maybe $40 a square foot, right? So what do you do when you're presented with this type of reality? You're really forced to whittle things down to the fundamentals, and to reiterate the lecture titles, to really do more with less. So we studied the building digitally, we made physical models, and what we learned is that there was a nearby factory that produced steel members. And even though we were interested in producing a building that would be reflective of place, we realized that the materials of this vernacular grammar evolves. And so we utilized concrete and steel for the execution of the building, but we used members that could be readily found in this factory that we could deploy in a serial way. And so what you see here is a prominent roof that extends nearly 2 meters beyond the building itself. And this was actually developed later. Originally, we actually had supports on either end, but then the roof was actually bracketed back, really editing the form down further. And what it does, ironically, is it doubles up the classroom spaces. So the building has both a series of interior classrooms, and when I say interior, they're not air conditioned. The entire building is passively cooled. So we developed a series of screens that would allow the building to respond to the sort of intense heat. But by extending the roof, we could double the size of the classrooms. So the building is able to be used both in interior and exterior. Here you see the building soon after it was opened. And I'm proud to say that as a result of the building of the prototype, the school was able to double its enrollment and be able to teach both by day and by night. You see here this elevated concrete plinth that rises well beyond the flood plain to allow the students to be protected, and also allows you to capture the breezes that move through this area. This is a view, probably one of my favorites of the project. There's a young boy that's sitting on that porch, and he's not old enough to go to school yet, but he sat there on a daily basis and listened to the classrooms, to the instruction that was taking place within. And so in a way, I think that the building served to promote not only a sort of dignified place where these young children can go to school, but perhaps associate learning with a place of pleasure and memory. And in our way, we thought this could be a small contribution to a building that is dedicated to educating this rural population. Here you see the end of the building, maybe the most iconic of the views. And you see again that prominent roof and the way in which the building is being used by its inhabitants and the way that perhaps we had hoped. And then finally, I think you see in the foreground a very, very large kind of drain that wraps itself around the entire building. And I just wanted to point this out because we have had the opportunity to travel extensively, and we have spent quite a bit of time in Japan where we studied a number of roofs. And what we learned from the Japanese was that the roof begins at the ridge and it ends at the ground. And so the water is collected into this large drain, actually collected into a cistern and reused, in fact. So while we were aspiring to kind of a regional response, we were taking lessons from these universal lessons that I think have relevance beyond just the immediate context. So returning back to Miami, this is a planned, this is a site plan of the city where we are actually mapping a number of public spaces, existing public spaces in the city. And here we see, again, the mainland to the west, and the Atlantic Ocean and Miami Beach to the east. And what we'd like to point out with this mapping was that currently Miami-Dade County has approximately 3 acres of public open space per 1,000 citizens, or really less than half of the national standard when you compare it to other metropolitan areas. So several of our projects in Miami have been dedicated to promoting the public realm, developing the public realm. And so the project that I will show you now is entitled Oak Plaza, and it's located within an 18-block neighborhood just north of downtown Miami. This neighborhood is referred to as the Design District, and along with nearby Wynwood, which is featured here, this part of the city has become home of leading designers, artists, galleries, showrooms. And many of you who might have traveled to Miami know that much of Art Basel, the contemporary art fair, takes place in and around this area of the city. So this was the existing site. It was a typical Miami underdeveloped asphalt parking lot, but within it stood a sublime landscape of mature white oaks, some of which were over 100 years old. In fact, older than, or close to being older than the city itself. And so from the beginning, our desire was to preserve this small remnant of native Florida hammock that was so exceptional within this district. We also wanted to clearly define a true center for the area by creating the first public plaza for the neighborhood. This is a site plan where you see the project highlighted at the center of the block. It's located within a typical rectangular Miami block. West of the site is Biscayne Boulevard, and the site is located north of the highway. In addition to the new plaza, the project included the design of a new street that allowed pedestrians to bisect the length of the block to further animate the street life of the neighborhood. From the beginning, the plaza was always the heart of the project. We transformed an existing parking lot into an urban carpet of Caribbean limestone. And the use of the limestone was important for us because this is a material that connects to this particular site, to its geological region, and to Miami's public building tradition. The north and the east edges of the space are defined by a thin bar building and loggia that were fused together. And we believe that this was important because it provided a continuous urban wall that would allow us to create frontages along a new space and its adjacent street. Both the form and the placement of the thin bar building resulted from the highly constraining and reduced space that we had to work with in order to preserve the trees. In the end, the building was seen as an urban infill and liner that was capable of addressing the different scales and events that were to be associated with the space. When it came to the design of the actual building, we employed Miami's vernacular traditions and methods of construction, largely concrete block and steel. We're still one of the few cities in the US that builds predominantly in concrete versus steel. And that's probably a multitude of reasons for this, but it further connects us to Latin America in that regard. But in the end, we chose to clad the surfaces of the building with a brilliant glass mosaic tile. The references for the tile cladding are also associated with figurative traditions that can be seen throughout the tropics and within the design district itself. Since from the beginning, we always thought of the elevations of the building as an urban painting or a mural. However, we used this tile and we were aware of the use of tile more broadly in the tropics. This material makes a great deal of sense in the tropics because it allows for the building to respond to the intense and harsh sunlight, a light that actually bleaches most other building materials. And it also allows for the building to weather and clean itself with the incessant rains. So the use of the surface tile was both a sort of response, again, to the material constructions of place, but our hopes that the building would weather across time, which is really what we believe that the public realm should do, in fact. This is a detail, a close-up detail of the building facade, where you can see that the building is considered a kind of pixelated surface that undulates and changes with the movement of light across the day. This is a final image of the building where you see the oolitic limestone carpet, which essentially frames the oaks within it, and then that liner building that I just described. I will share with you that this particular space was demolished about 6 years after it was finished. And the reason I share that is because there is a kind of phenomena in Miami where public space is largely being built by the private developer. And so on the one hand, this is an extraordinary reality and it has had successes. But what this revealed to us is that this is fragile. When one develops a public space on private property, you risk the fact that it could be lost, in fact, depending upon developmental pressures. So if you go to the design district now, you'll find an Hermes flagship around this corner. I'm just going to briefly mention this just to show that the development of the public realm in the city has been a preoccupation. This is a project that we are currently working on in another adjacent neighborhood to the design district. And once again, it's a private developer that is seeking to build I would say, semi-public space. And in this particular case, the desire was to build a dog park for the city. And here you see an axonometric where you're seeing the surrounding fabric, which is quite blown out in this area of the city. And you see our intervention, which has a liner building against the street, which is modeled on a dog trot house, which I'll explain in a minute. And then the remainder of the property is actually a tall screen of a similar color, so that when you actually pass into the project, you feel as though you're within one sort of singularly conceived space. At the center of the project is the park, or the dog park, and surrounding it in gray is a kind of flexible space that can be used for festivals or temporary exhibitions or even outdoor movies and theaters. So it provides you a kind of static center where the dogs can run around while you have a more active perimeter. This is a longitudinal section of the project. And finally, a view through the main entry of the building, which again is modeled on the dog trot house, which had a very large central covered porch with flanking functions to either side. In this particular case, a small cafe and a retail space that frames a view of that internal park within. This last project is quite different than the previous ones that I've just shown you. And it's entitled Hope House. And it really, I think we're ending with this because this is really a project that is currently on the boards. And during COVID, all of us, we've all been inside for extended periods of time. And let's say in our case, Adib and I have the good fortune to be able to live within comfortable settings that allowed us to continue to work, really have our office and children that continued to be online. But it made us acutely aware of home. And this really has reinforced our interest in developing housing in Miami, housing that really can cross through that kind of social spectrum. At the moment, Miami's housing tends to operate at the extremes. We're either the kind of high-rise condominium or the detached single-family house. We have what could be referred to as a kind of missing middle. And within that missing middle, there's a great need for affordable housing and workforce housing. Just to put this in context, Miami is the nation's most unaffordable large city, with 57% of its households paying more than 30% of their income on housing costs, and nearly 33% of renter households paying upwards of 50% of their income on rent. This reality threatens Miami's future economy, businesses, and the development of its neighborhoods. To significantly reduce the growing housing affordability gap, Miami is going to need to build approximately 32,000 affordable housing units by 2030. Our last project, entitled Hope House, presents a small-scale affordable housing project that strives to address this need. The neighborhood where we will be working is Liberty City. This neighborhood was once a thriving middle-income community in Miami. Due to a variety of national and local policies, including the building of the interstate highway, seen here in pink, that basically severed Liberty City, predominantly Black community, from the surrounding context. This act, along with a series of other policies, began a period of urban and economic and social decline that led to increased crime and poverty, a reality that continues to this day. In recent years, the city of Miami has begun to address these challenges facing the future growth and sustainability of Liberty City by advancing new urban land use policies that promote new projects in the area. This is not only a response to the deteriorating conditions of this neighborhood, but also to the realities of climate change. Located at a higher elevation than many of the city's waterfront communities, neighborhoods like Liberty City are now becoming more desirable areas for investment. However, much of this new development will not address the needs of the current community and will likely displace many of its residents through policies that will accelerate gentrification. This particular project is being done in collaboration with an extraordinary group of developers, young female developers by the name of Aina. And we are partnering with the Ladies of Hope Ministries, seen here, which is a non-for-profit organization dedicated to ending poverty and incarceration for women and girls. They chose Miami for the development of their first building due to the high levels of female incarceration as compared to other US metropolitan areas. According to national statistics, US correctional facilities annually incarcerate more than 230,000 women and girls, oftentimes for misdemeanor crimes that could be better addressed through rehabilitative programs designed to repair the underlying causes of such behavior. When these women are released from prison, their criminal records become a high barrier to employment, and as such, they're kept out of civic life in a perpetual cycle of impoverishment, compounding trauma and life-shattering hardship. So what would a country with a vastly reduced reliance on incarceration look like? This project works to imagine such a nation through the design of a resilient and sustainable housing prototype that provides the physical backdrop to the advocacy programs and economic empowerment that accompanies each woman's residency. By empowering these women, we believe that we can improve entire families and in turn create more stable, sustainable, and productive communities. So this site is located, as I mentioned earlier, along Martin Luther King Boulevard. It's a 50 by 100-foot parcel. That's the typical parcel in Miami. And we were particularly interested in developing a project at that scale. We were interested because we believe that it's at the smaller incremental scales that smaller developers and even local community activists can engage in the development of the city incrementally. The zoning in this area is going to dramatically change. It's becoming much, much denser. So as we began to think about the site, we couldn't really design for the context that exists. We had to design for the context that is projected, which again is a much denser phenomena. And so the sketch on the right was our initial investigations into the urban typologies and morphologies that could adopt to these increasing densities. And we came upon the use of the courtyard as being one of the most rich and resilient urban prototypes. Here you see not just one courtyard actually, but you see two. You see a kind of semicircular courtyard that's carved at the back of the building, and the primary courtyard that is actually here on the east. Why do I begin with the question of urban morphology, right? It's not a particularly sexy theme. It's not particularly glamorous. But when you study cities, you realize that cities are made up incrementally by a series of types that tend to repeat themselves for a variety of reasons. In Miami, what ended up happening is that this became the predominant type that is developed throughout the city, actually. You could argue that in footprint, it looks like a courtyard type, but it does a number of things that actually don't engage in the sort of promotion of a centralized courtyard. In part because the stairs line the exterior, and those stairs lead you to corridors, exterior corridors, that tend to privatize the units. Why? Because the circulation allows you to look into the units, and so ultimately the development of those facades on the interior tend to be small windows and doors, so they promote a more kind of insular reality. So we were looking at this context carefully and thinking, well, how might we displace these pieces in such a way that we could deploy the courtyard type, but allow for those that are living in the units to be able to enjoy the court, and also allow for a certain degree of privacy that would allow us to open up those units to light and air. So through very modest but simple means, we kind of aligned the principal facade of the building with two units. We actually displaced the central bar in the apartment seen here in the center drawing to be able to allow for the circulation to be on the back side of the units, to allow for those units to open up to the court. And then finally, on what will be eventually the sort of alley side of the building, we carved out two other units with that small sculpted semicircular court. The ground floor, we were able to adopt a small retail space, a kind of micro retail space at the ground. And then through a sort of careful collaboration with the developers, we were able to cap the building with a communal or sort of amenity that allow for the 20 units to gather and have larger social gatherings and really come together as a community. Once again, you'll see, we sort of go out and we look at the landscape, and here again, we see the use of tile in the city. On the one hand, the top left is a very famous building. It's the Bacardi building in Miami, where you see this beautiful painted tile that was done in the 1950s. But you find the same reality throughout many corners of the city in more humble ways if you seek to find it. So the lower images are all from Liberty City. They're tiled facades, they're highly colored facades, they're sculpted facades with the stucco. And again, we're searching for the kind of extraordinary in the ordinary. These were initial models of the building. So we built a sort of physical model where you see the primary facade on Martin Luther King, which is a more rational facade that adjusts itself to the street. And then you see the side that faces the courtyard is a sculpted elevation where we've scooped out the facade so that light can enter. This is also one that is more expressive, sorry. And then finally, this will be the party wall elevation, which obviously has no fenestration because eventually another building will be set up right against it. This is that sculpted court from above. And so we were searching for a space that would sort of turn in on itself and promote collaboration across the units, or sort of visual connection across the units. This is an elevation with a plan that folds back the different elevations, and we were looking really each side of the building proposed different challenges, but we were looking in all cases to produce a type that would allow for each one of the units to have a kind of unique experience. These are a series of views that we produced. And again, this is a project that's literally on the boards, but where you see the kind of small bakery, which is a kind of micro retail at the ground level. We fought hard for this. It seems like a very simple thing. You know, you're providing retail at grade. But actually this took a great deal of effort because most of the other types in the city erode the streetscape, and they bring parking all the way up to the front of the building. And so if you imagine that happening time and time and time again, you can imagine how the character and the quality of living in the city would be eroded. So the micro retail at grade, this is a typical unit where you're seeing one of the women looking out onto the gumbo limbo tree that is planted in the courtyard with very large windows that do not have to be privatized because no one's going to be walking in front of you. Finally, the upper space, which is the communal space, is the space where they can gather and share meals together or have workshops together. And from that elevated sort of position, you can actually gain a view of the city that you are now participating in. This final image is an image of that sculpted courtyard. You know, the back is always supposed to be the undesirable unit, the one that no one wants to rent, right? And when we were designing this building, and I think when we design all buildings, we place ourselves within that process and we ask ourselves, would we want to live in this space? Could we live in this space? And so we wanted to take what could be regarded as the least desirable units and provide a kind of sculpted courtyard that would allow for those spaces to be desirable in as much as those that might face the street. And so looking up here, you're looking across the back side of the units. And in this particular case, seeing two units on either side of that sort of closely sculpted court. So maybe to leave you with a final thought is we recently finished a book entitled The Future of the Professions. And it's written by Richard and Daniel Susskind, a team of lawyers, where they pointed out that less than 5% of the world's buildings are designed by architects. Less than 5%. This was startling to us. I mean, we always knew that the number was low, but we didn't know it was that low. So I guess there are two ways that you can view this. You can either think it's a sort of depressing reality, or better yet, which is the way that we like to think about this, this is an unprecedented opportunity to expand the impact of architects in the future. For you, for us, for all of us, to provide value to communities that are typically disconnected from the services of a designer or an architect. And to do this, we will need to rethink how we work and who we work for and with. We're going to need to be creative and we're going to need to be entrepreneurial. We believe that to do this, history is still relevant, maybe now more than ever. Architectural knowledge of buildings, knowledge of cities is relevant now more than ever. Landscape is relevant. A curiosity of place in its fullest and complex sense is relevant. And we hope that the projects that we showed you here today reveal our commitment to this. Thank you so much.